Everybody, good morning, for good afternoon, I guess, by the time you watch this. For the 5 of you who actually watch these videos, thank you very much for staying with me all quarter. Yeah, this is our second to last review video. I hope these are helpful for you. I think those of you who are watching them will benefit. Hopefully some other people will go back and watch a few of these before the exam. We're talking today about responses to imperialism. So you remember that yesterday we reviewed the causes for imperialism, especially the need for industrial nations to acquire raw materials like cotton and rubber and tea and markets to sell the stuff that they make in their factories back to their colonies. So those are the two main motivations for driving imperialism. And today we're going to look at responses to imperialism. It's going to be a quick overview. You guys know a lot about this, and you should go back to your notes, back to your reading, review this stuff on your own. The point of the lecture is just kind of a quick reminder to refresh your memory. So responses to imperialism basically comes in two forms: resistance and reform. So you either fight back, usually you lose, or you change your society so that you adapt and adjust, and maybe you give up some economic control in exchange for not being conquered or for being more peacefully conquered by European or American industrial powers. We're going to start looking at resistance. So the most common form of response to imperialism is resistance. We see this beginning in China with the Opium Wars. You remember that China was the Middle Kingdom. No civilization in the world was better than China for basically several thousand years. The rest of the world wanted to trade with China. Everyone wanted access to China's luxury goods. People wanted access to China's incredible technology, like compasses and astrolabes and paper and gunpowder, to name a few. So China is basically the most advanced civilization in the world until industrialization hits. Industrialization then gives Europeans a leg up. They want to use their industrial weapons to leverage, to force China to trade. Remember, as part of the Opium War, the British were losing millions and millions of dollars worth of money in silver, buying tea, primarily tea from China. Tea is the fuel of the industrial working class, tea and sugar. You get a cup of tea and sugar in the morning, at break, at lunch, afternoon break, after work, it keeps you going. Caffeine and sugar. So the British are getting tea from the Americas through plantation agriculture, coerced labor. They're getting sugar from the Americas. They're getting tea from India and China. They want and need both of those to fuel their industrial workers. And they realize that they're just bleeding silver into China buying all this tea and silk. So they start exchanging opium for tea instead. But China realizes that opium is bad for their economy. It's bad for their military. Opium addiction is a problem, and they're not getting all that money that they were getting from exchanging tea for silver when they're exchanging tea for opium instead. So it's not a good deal for China, and they try to stop this opium trade, at which point the British say, no, we can trade, we should be able to trade with you whatever your customers are willing to buy. China resists. They try to stop trade with Britain, and this triggers the Opium Wars. The nemesis is the classic, perfect example for you of a specific key term, a specific example for industrial military technology that allows Europeans to conquer non-industrialized countries. The nemesis is a steam-powered gunboat. It sails right into the heart of China and essentially forces China to surrender because they don't have technology to stop this kind of boat in 1839, 1840. After Britain opens up China in the Opium Wars, the rest of Europe arrives as well. And you remember they carve up China into something known as spheres of influence. China is forced to sign unequal treaties with Britain, where they give up basically all their economic power to these European foreign influences. And it basically ends a 2,000-year run of China being the most powerful, most advanced civilization in the world. As a result of the loss of the Opium Wars, a couple of major events happen in China. The Taiping Rebellion is the most significant. It weakens the Qing dynasty incredibly. 20 to 30 million people die, 70 million total with famine that follows this Taiping Rebellion. This is basically a civil war in China that is triggered by China's loss of status, their economic weakness compared to the European industrialized powers. So this isn't the Taiping Rebellion isn't really an anti-European rebellion. It's more like a civil war. But then we see the Boxer Rebellion is a clear another example of resistance against imperialism. The Boxers were really just, this is 60 years after the Opium Wars, and they're tired of European influence in China. So they revolt, they kill, they target Europeans, they target Chinese sympathizers, Chinese families and businesses that work closely with the European powers. And in response, the European powers bring this like multinational army that includes the United States, and they quell this rebellion and increase their basically imperial control of China. So resistance didn't work out so well for China. And Japan also is opened up by an industrial power. It is the United States. 1853, Commodore Perry arrives with a steam-powered gunboat, and he says, "Hey, Japan, we want to trade with you, and you should trade with us or we're going to conquer you." And Japan says, all right, let's trade instead of having you conquer us with your industrial weapons. But there was resistance. The great example of resistance in Japan is known as the Satsuma Rebellion. It's more of a resistance to the reformers in Japan than to a fight against European imperialists or American imperialists. But it is an example of resistance to imperialism within Japan. Satsuma Rebellion was led by the samurai class who did not want to give up their ways. They didn't want to give up their status. They didn't think that Japan should modernize and become like the West, like Europe or the United States. And this rebellion gets quelled pretty easily by machine guns and industrial produced rifles. Swords don't do much against those, unfortunately, for the rebelling samurai. In India, we also see resistance. You remember it's the Sepoy Rebellion in 1857. The Sepoys were actually soldiers for the British. They worked for the British government. They worked for the joint stock companies. But they get tired of Britain's increased assumption of power in India. They get tired of the arrogance. They get tired of the British spreading Christianity. And then a couple of triggers of this rebellion were the British giving them bullets that were greased with pig fat or cow fat, which offended both Muslims and Hindus. The seizure of a province called Oudh, which was a very important historical and cultural province for the Mughal and Hindu Indians in India. And then the conversion of or the attempted conversion of Hindus and Muslims to Christianity by the British. All those things triggered the Sepoy Rebellion. Like all of these other examples of resistance, the rebellion is quelled, and it actually increases the power and influence of the Europeans. In India, it leads to the formation of the British Raj, so the elimination of, so the British East India Company loses its authority to control India, and the British government, the Queen, becomes the direct Queen of India. India becomes a part of the British Empire directly, not indirectly as it had been from about 1750 until 1857, whereas an indirect colony more controlled by the joint stock companies than by the government of Britain itself. And India then is transformed into a cotton and tea plantation, essentially, for Britain. It produces cotton, it produces tea. Britain turns those raw materials into finished goods and sells the cotton back to India, which is why Gandhi was so adamant about boycotting British textiles, because he was tired of seeing Indian resources leave India, get made into fabric in Britain, and then sold back to the Indians at increased prices. It was all a big ripoff for the Indians. They're exploited at both ends, so to speak. Resistance in Africa, this also doesn't go well for the resistors. We saw the Battle of Omdurman in 1898, 52,000 Sudanese versus 24,000 British and Egyptian troops. The British and Egyptian troops lose less than 30, and the Sudanese lose tens of thousands. The Anglo-Zulu War is another example of resistance. They actually win against the British. They catch the British surprised, and the Zulus with spears and shields defeat an industrialized British army. But then Britain comes back with a vengeance, with a much more equipped army, and subdues the Zulus in the second wave of the Anglo-Zulu War. We talked about the Maji Maji Rebellion. Again, this doesn't go well for the resistors. They are facing industrial rifles, industrialized, the Maxim gun, machine guns. They're facing armor, all the things that they don't have, with their spears and shields, and yeah, it doesn't go well. We do have a great example of successful resistance. You remember the Battle of Adwa, 1896. Ethiopians resist Italian aggression. Italians are trying to get control of their little slice of Africa, and King Menelik II defeated this Italian invasion force. How did he do it? He bought up a lot of industrial rifles, he bought up industrial weapons, he bought cannons, and he bought up as much as he could from Europeans. A lot of this military equipment he bought from Russia. And because he was equipped with industrial weapons and a very astute emperor for his kingdom, he saved Ethiopia from being conquered by the Italians. So what are the reform movements? If you resisted, you were generally subdued unless you were Ethiopia. And some of these reform movements come after the rebellion, and some of them come instead of rebellion. So in China, the reform movements were the self-strengthening movement and the 100 Days reforms. Both of these were after China had already kind of lost its rebellion. They've lost the Opium Wars. And the self-strengthening movement was a movement to industrialize, to modernize its economy, to modernize the education system. 100 Days Reform similarly was a more radical form of industrialization. The two reformers who led it were named Kang and Liang. And both of them were moderately successful. They built some railroads, they built some factories, but economic transformation doesn't really come, industrial transformation doesn't really come for China until after the Communist Revolution of Mao Zedong in the 50s with the Great Leap Forward. Japan's reforms, you guys know well, this is the Meiji Restoration, this idea of selective westernization. We're going to take some things, we're going to learn as much as we can from the West, from Europe, from the United States. We're going to learn how to build factories, we're going to learn how to build a navy, a modern army. We're going to do as much as we can to catch up with Europe. And if that means we have to give up some of our economic autonomy and we have to make some trade concessions with Europeans and Americans, so be it. This idea of selective westernization that is led by the Meiji Emperor, so it's also known as the Meiji Restoration. The Ottoman Empire wasn't directly threatened by Europe, but they, as a huge empire right next to Europe, realized that they were getting behind and they needed to catch up. So the Ottoman reforms include investing in infrastructure, railroads and telegraph lines. The Tanzimat reforms, which are government reforms that make the Ottoman government, gives the people a little more choice in their government. It embraces a little bit more popular sovereignty. It also eliminates some of the old Ottoman systems like the millet system and the devshirme. It eliminates those kind of tribute systems. And it modernizes the legal code to make a more constitutional legal code similar to what exists in Europe and in the United States. The Ottoman reforms are led by a group known as the Young Turks. In Russia, the reforms that we see are led by this man, Sergei Witt. They involve creating a national bank, savings banks for the people, the abolition of serfdom, getting rid of essentially slavery in Russia. Serfdom was a form of coerced labor, similar to slavery, but not really like chattel slavery. So savings banks that are providing loans, are building railways. The Zemstvos are local councils that are given more voice in the local government, local economy. They create a parliamentary system of government instead of an absolute monarchy. So all of these reforms are attempts by Russia to catch up with the rest of Europe. And that's it. That concludes our quick lecture on resistance and reform to imperialism. Hope you enjoyed it. And we've got one lecture to go. So see you again tomorrow, and then we're done.